Hello and welcome back to the 6-inch Summer Squares series. Before we continue on, I'd like to show you how to make a simple journal out of fabric, paper, linen, felt, or whatever you'd like. A personal fabric journal is such a great way to keep your experiments with textiles. A journal is put together with a front and back cover, and the page sets between them are called signatures. You can use as many signatures as you'd like and as many pages within the signatures as you like. But for this tutorial, we'll use 3 signatures of 3 pages each. In this journal's 3 signatures, I made with just 2 pages of one-sided fusible Peltex, and then I fused fabric on the outside signature pages just for interest when you see them from the outer spine of the book. So you're not just seeing white Peltex, you're seeing some fabric. The pages are heavier here, and it would be a nice option for the Summer Squares blocks if you're going to be using your blocks to stitch into a journal. I'd say grab some Peltex, enough so that you can do 2 or 3 pages per signature. We're going to be cutting these 6 by 12 just so you know your measurements. And then you'll have these nice heavy pages to stitch your blocks into. So working with 2 pages in each signature of 3 will technically give you 12 pages because of course we're folding these signatures in half. If you did 3 pages within the signatures, you'll have 18 pages, which means room for more blocks. And the pages are double-sided, so if you did 2 page signatures, you will have 24 block places, and 3 would give you 36. And then if you did blocks on the inside cover back and front, you'd have 2 more. So you can hold a lot of blocks even if you just did 2 pages per signature. This journal here has 5 signatures of 3 pages each, which are comprised of all kinds of different fabrics. So this journal has 30 pages. I use felt and linen and paper and fabric, so I had the options of working both outside the journal and then stitching my pieces into the pages, or I could work directly into the pages if I had a quick idea. When you open to the center of a signature page, you'll be able to see the Coptic binding stitch. The great thing about the Coptic stitch is that you can use as many pages or signatures as you like, because as you stitch, the signatures are stitched in individually, so the binding will grow with the book. When you open to an outside edge of the signature, you'll be able to see the pretty Coptic stitch knots. And when you have a book this full, I think it would be super fun to open it up on a table and display it in the round. So with this book, I think I'm going to do that. I have a bunch of materials left over from my lantern box in the alchemy colorway, so I'm going to make one from those. I have a fun idea that this would be a journal that I keep the notes in for a game that my boyfriend Jerry and I are developing called Twisted Sisters. It's about nuns who kind of lose their mind and fall to their alter egos and cause all kinds of havoc. So we're having a lot of fun developing this game, and this fabric is going to be perfect just to keep some notes. So I'll probably be putting a lot of paper and things inside, but I'm going to work with fabric just to show you how to put this together. So what you'll need is 2 6-inch pieces of the heavy 1 or 2-sided fusible Peltex. It's interfacing. Pellon makes it. Peltex is another brand. If it's not fusible, it's okay. You can glue it. You can use Misty Fuse or some other fusible paper to adhere your fabric to. And then in the upper left-hand corner, you can see I have 2 6-inch pieces of fabric that I have pressed onto the covers. On the bottom left-hand corner, you see I have 2 pieces of 7-inch fabric. That'll be the outside cover. So, and of course, you can use 2 different fabrics like I did in my other journals. And then as far as the signatures go, I've got wool felt for all 3 of my outer signature pages. If you're going to do the Peltex within your pages, just make sure that the outside of one of those is covered with a 6 by 12 inch piece of fabric. You would just press it on, and then the rest of your pages can just be left blank in that Peltex in that first journal I showed you. But here I'm doing fabric. So I have a piece of 6 by 12 inch wool felt for my outer pieces, 3 of those. And then within those, I'm doing 2 6 by 12 inch pieces of fabric. And I lay them all facing straight up. It really doesn't matter, because if you come to a page where the wrong side of the fabric is showing, then you can just cover that with something else, you know. And what I would say is, on the right side of the fabric, you can work inside the journal, do your stitching or whatever, and then take an idea or something you've done outside of the journal that you want to pin in and just pin it to the wrong side. So it really doesn't matter which way they face. And of course, if you use batiks, they're double-sided, so that's great. And then I've got starch here, just so that the pages are a little bit more easy to manage. You'll need a marking pen. I've got a silver one here since I'm working with really dark fabric, because you want to mark where you're going to stitch your holes. And then as far as what to stitch with, you can use DMC floss. You can use like size 3 pearl cotton would be pretty. Here I have a sport weight white sock yarn, although I think I've got some size 3 gray pearl cotton. I may use that in the video. I'm not sure yet. I'm still trying to decide. And then a really sharp needle. And that's basically it. To prepare your signature pages, fold each one in half so that it's a 6 by 6, and just give it a little press down the center. That way you're sure that you're stitching through the center of the spines. And then to prepare your covers, you'll place your inside cover face up on top of your 7-inch fabric, and then just take a rotary or a scissor and clip the corners. Then take your iron and press the edges down over the inside. Now, you have a couple options here as far as adhering them. If you don't like the little fringes coming off the side of a fabric, you can take a piece of seam or a double-sided interfacing and fuse it to your fabric first, and then cut it to size and clip your corners. Then just simply pull the paper off and fold the pieces down and press them on. I don't have that with me. I don't mind the edges rough on a journal. I think it's more interesting that it's kind of messy and just like a place to keep notes. I kind of love that. So what I did here is I just glued the edges down around the piece, and making sure that I put a lot of glue in the corner, and then you just let that sit for 15-20 minutes to dry. And then here's my back and front cover. And then the inside, go ahead and open up your signature, your first signature, which will be the bottom one, the back one, because we're going to start with the back building up, and pin the corners just so that the pages don't shift while you stitch. Okay, and then next you're going to want to mark where you're going to stitch into. I marked the middle, and this gel pen will brush off, the ink will brush off. So I'm going to make a pretty big mark so I can see where I'm doing. 1/4 inch away, make another mark on either side of that center. And then 1/4 inch away from the top, put 3 marks. Every 1/4 inch, but same thing on the bottom. Okay, and then so this is the top of my journal. So the bottom, same thing. Make sure you're orienting your fabric if you have motifs so that everything is right side up. So the holes we know need to come on this side, so we're going to turn it around. And then make those same marks. Now if you were using paper, a lot of times what people do is they'll use an owl or a punch and punch these holes out. Makes it really easy to stitch into. So place this on the 1/4 inch edge, and then just make those same marks on the inside, 1/4 inch apart. Using these creative grid rulers or rulers with a half, just be mindful that you are using the side that doesn't have the half markers in it. So my center, this is 1 inch here from the top. So the center is, and right into the fold, we're going to pop the 1/4 inch marks. And you'll do that for all of your signatures that you're using. Okay, and I did end up finding my size 3 pearl cotton. So what I did is I'm going to start with a 2-yard length, and I've tied a knot on one side. And then if you're going to use this twisty kind of rope, just be mindful of which way it's going to pull through the fabric better. You can run your finger along the thread, and whatever side feels smoother, that's the side you want to put your needle on. That's the side you're going to want to glide through the fabric. So the first thing you do is at the very bottom of your bottom signature, remember we're working from the bottom of the journal, the back of the journal, up. So you're just going to place your needle into the first stitch here and through all 3 pieces. So that knot will sit just inside. Fold your book. Okay, and then just place your signature on your back journal and pop it through the hole, that very first hole that you marked on the back. This is going to take some muscle and some maneuvering, and a lot of times, you know, I'll even get a pliers and take it and pull it through so it's not so hard on my fingers. Okay, and then just all the way through. Okay, and then once you have that, you're going to bring it through the exact same hole again, not through your signature, just through the cover. So if you can manage to get that in the same hole, try not to pierce your first thread you went into. So when you come up, just come up through that same hole. It might be easier to get it through the second time around. And then bring your needle again through the same hole through the signature. Try not to pierce that knot, or that's just one more level of fabric you're going to have to try to bring everything through. But if you pierce the thread, that'll hold that in even better. So again, a little bit of muscle here. Okay, and then you're just going to take and go through the center fold of all of those pieces. Again, making sure you're coming out 1/4 inch from here. And you want to keep everything not super tight, but taut. You know, enough where it's going to hold it really well, but you're not pulling it so tight that you can't work with it. And if it loosens up here, just take your needle and pull on it. Okay, and then you're just going to repeat what you did before. So you're going to go into the next hole that you've marked. On the back, just make sure you're coming out of the second hole there. Just pull slowly. There's lots of pins and stuff that's going to get in your way. Okay, and then ignoring the signature there, go through that hole, that same hole again. It might be easier too if you pull down on the thread. Just make sure you're coming out of that same hole. Got it looped, so I'm going to avoid that so we don't have any tangles. Pull that tight. And then come through that same hole on your signature again. Make sure you're coming through the same hole. There you go. Right next to it. And then you're just going to keep repeating that right up the spine. So you're coming out here. into the third hole that you marked. That Peltex is great stuff, but it is not the easiest to pull your needle through. It's just part of the process. If you have a teeny tiny little hole punch though, you could punch the holes in here and make your life a lot easier. Of course, I do have one, but it is not here with me, so I'm just gonna struggle through. Okay, and then before you go back into the signature, make sure you go back into just the back again, coming out of the same hole, and then back through the same spot in your signature. And before you pull it all the way through, of course, just open it up and make sure you're coming out of that same hole. And now you're just going to bring it all the way up to the middle. Pop it through. Just keep checking every once in a while, make sure your pages are staying put. And then go through the first hole that you marked. One of the things that you can do is just open up your book and put a clip, not so much on both of the pages because you're going to need to keep opening it, but just right here. So that'll keep that centered. Okay, and when you've come to the end and you've done your one wraparound on the cover only, you're going to put the second signature on. Go ahead and pin the corners again. What I did was I took my clip out, I folded the first signature, and then I put the right side of the signature on here and clipped that all together so that I just have the top of this signature that I'm working with. So rather than go back into the first signature, what you're going to do is come out the second. We'll guess on the outside and we'll open it up and see how well we did. Pretty good, right out of the center of that dot. Go through all layers and then come out the second dot. It's going to seem a little weird and loose here, but don't worry about that because we're going to come back and we'll address that when we come back up to the top. But we don't have a cover to go into this time, so instead we're going to just go into this little knot, not pierce any fabric or any threads. We're just going under the knot. So you're creating this little loop around the wraps that you did previously. And then back into that same hole. Open your book, make sure. Just keep checking, making sure your book is straight-ish. Back down into the third hole. And as you come out, just make sure it lines up with the knot underneath that you did. From bottom to top, we're just going to go around the loops. Try to get around both of them. Back into the same hole. And then all the way down here. Come out and make sure, don't pierce the signature below it. And make sure you're just centering right over that stitch that you did below. Okay, all the way down to the bottom. Okay, and then when you get down to the bottom of that, the last thing you're going to do is make your little loop around those last two stitches. And then you're going to put your third signature on. Again, just clip it on here. The second signature is completely folded. Pin your corners. Take the thread and then go into the third signature. Pull that through and then into the second dot. So really you're scooping all the way back in between the signatures and just picking up the thread grouping there. A little tricky if your needle's really sharp like mine not to pierce the fabric. I don't know if it's the end of the world, but that's not the true Coptic stitch. You're not really piercing anything because most of the time this is done with paper. There we go. And then back into that same hole. Back in all the way up, and then we'll put the cover on. So you can start to see you're starting to get these little braids up the side. All the way back here. Out, and when it comes out, just make sure it's lining up with what's below it. And follow that path all the way back up to your first stitch. So when you get back to the beginning and you're coming out of your third, go all the way down to the first one. And that secures it a little bit better because remember we just had that one little loop there. Okay, so now it's time to put the cover on. So you are coming out of the very bottom loop here. Okay, and then what you're going to do is come all the way up to the cover in your first hole there. Then we're trying to mimic these little chains, right? So between the first and the second signature, we're going to go down from the top to the bottom. So that's a little bit different because we've always been coming in from the bottom to the top. And I'm just staying under that loop, or below the loop, I should say. And that way when I pull the needle out, this will look like that same kind of chain. So I'm just going to hide it and bury it behind that little chain of knots. But open your signature up to make sure you're coming through the right spot. And then out that same hole and exiting out the same hole as that chain. And then into the cover in that second hole. Find your loop. This is between the first and the second signature. Okay, so that mimics that hugging chain coming down. See that? And then back down again, just through the cover and below this chain as you're heading towards the bottom. And then sneak that into that same hole in the first signature behind this row of chains here. So it's sort of like behind the loop in the same hole. Just pop it in there and then open your journal and make sure that you're coming out real close to that second. Okay. Out the same hole. We're very, very close. And then up through the cover. behind the loop of between the first and the second signature. And then again, it's a little different because we're going down from out to back in. And stay below that chain there. And then you see when you pull it tight, that top loop hugs the chains just like the ones below it. Right, so I've snuck it into here. I've got a big long string, second string here. Looks pretty. Come out the same hole as the first signature and then in through the cover only on that first dot. If you can find it. There we go. And then this is the different part where you just flip it and you go through the cover from outer to inner rather than in out again. Just through the cover. Sneak it back into that first signature behind all of this and then continue along to the end. And then when you're coming out of the very last stitch of the first signature, come back down here, make your little loop down below just like you did on the very first one. Then come up through the cover in the last little spot there. Scoop up the loop. Sorry, I keep turning this. It's just so awkward the other way, so I hope that's not confusing. And then pop it through here. And then the very last thing you're going to do is just hide that knot between that first signature and that first space. Come back out and then tie a knot. And what I would say is when you're putting your needle through, just split the fibers of the stitch that you're working on. Just to ensure that knot doesn't come out. You can always throw a little dab of super glue. Be cute to even leave this and crochet it, and then you'd have a bookmarker. All kinds of things you can do. Little tassel, beads. And then clip it. And then you've got your very own journal, Coptic stitch binding, just beautiful. So just a couple things. If you hate these raw edges here, I mean, obviously, depending on what you put in your journal, you can hide them. You know, just take your square and stitch over them. If you use Peltex, you've got perfect canvases for your blocks. But if you decided to do all these different little fabrics while you're making your signatures, you can actually take two pieces of fabric, put your fusible interfacing on them, and stick them together. And that would make stronger pages and not these raw edges. If you decide you want to do paper, the kind of paper that I was using was mulberry paper. It's super strong, so you can paint on it, you can stitch on it. There's beads on this page. It's really cool paper. So if you just go into like a paper supply place, wherever they make handmade paper, you can almost always find mulberry paper. And if you wanted to use this for like a personal cookbook, that would be a really awesome thing to do. Like for me in this journal, as I mentioned, I'm going to take some notes and probably use a lot of paper. So I'll probably make some notes on mulberry paper away from the book and then stitch it in, you know, make sure that the paper is really beautiful and just how I want it. And then I'll probably just hand stitch it in on these pages. So I think that'll be really neat. So I'll have to keep you updated as I'm working on that. But I can't wait to see your journals, what you've chosen and what you're gonna stitch in them, whether it's gonna be block keeper or embroidery or cookbook or drawing, whatever. The Coptic stitch is such a beautiful way to use up materials and make a book that is uniquely yours. Okay, on to Pajagi, or Pojagi is another way to say it. It's an old Korean piecing technique that is done with silks or linen or cotton. It allows you to have a double-sided fabric that is great for gift wrapping, clothing, and even window treatments. To find out a little bit more, just Google Pojagi and you will find a wealth of information and history right on the internet. Last week I was playing around with a couple of the different Pajagi seams, and this one is called the Kecky Seam. It's got 3 seam treatments per seam, so it's super time consuming, meaning each stitch has to be, or each seam has to be stitched 3 times. It really creates a cool fabric, and it is double-sided, but because I used commercial fabrics, it did look like there was a right side and a wrong side. So what I did was I crocheted a 9-inch block. This was an 8-inch piece that I was just playing around with. I crocheted a 9-inch block, and then I stitched the patchwork onto it, leaving the loops free, because I was kind of thinking this would be a really cool quilt if you did a bunch of Pajagi patchwork squares and then put them on these crochet blocks and then crochet them together. It's really pliable and it's soft and it's warm, it's bulky. But then the other thing I was thinking of last week, we made these little drink protectors, and this I think would just be so perfect as a trivet to put, you know, your picture of lemonade or margaritas on, and then use these. So it's going to be kind of a cool set. So I'm going to work on more of these and then have a set here with me, which I love. And then I decided I wanted to try a different seam, which I like better, and that's the one I'm going to show you, and that is called Geobio Bockey seam. Say it with me, Geobio Bockey. What a mouthful. But I love the seam. I think the right side and the wrong side look really beautiful, and it's all decorative stitching. So right here I use 2 strands of DMC floss in the same color, and that's what I'm going to use to just stitch this whole thing together. What's really cool about this is when the last thing you do is you stitch this seam down here, and there's a big space, so it allows you to put in some trim or lace little bits that you might have, and then of course that lends itself beautifully to Oya. And so at the end of this, I will show you a new Oya pattern, one that we can pop right in to the seam here. And this is so pretty when you hold it up to a window or hold it up to the light. You can see the light shining through the fabrics, yet you can also see the construction of the block in the seam. So I can definitely see why they make window treatments with this technique, because it will allow you to have privacy but also let the light shine in. Okay, so here we go with the Geobio Bockey. Gosh, that's really fun to say. I've got 2 little scraps of shot cotton here, and again, this will work with silk, linen, anything that's double-sided to begin with will be perfect for this. Shot cotton's really great because the fabric is so light. The warp and the weft on these are woven with 2 different colors, and so you get this really magical, almost iridescent effect. I'm pinning one fabric under another fabric 1/2 inch away from the edge. I've got 2 strands of DMC floss here. And then with the knot on the top, because we are going to bury this seam, and not right up to the edge because there's going to be some trimming happening. So about 1/4 inch away, I'm just going to do a running stitch. Maybe pick up 2 or 3 pieces and then pull it through. And I'm 1/8 inch away from this edge here. And it's going to show on the other side as well, so you're going to want to be as even as you can. Don't go for perfection, of course, because this is handcrafted, so we want to see that little individual human work. So perfection isn't essential. So when it gathers up a little bit like this, just pull on it and straighten out the fabric a little bit. 1/4 inch from the edge, exit out and then just knot it right here on the top, because again, we're going to cover this little raw seam here. So open it up and press it towards both the seams. Of course, you can use an iron here. I'm just going to use my fingernail and run it along this seam here. Okay, so that little 1/8 of an inch seam is underneath, and press it away. Fold it back up. Press this under 1/4 of an inch just so that the raw edges match each other. Fold it back up on your pressed seam. So what's going to happen is that that's going to allow the stitching that you did to come right up on the right side of the piece. Now before you stitch that down, make sure you open your fabrics back up, pin it here, and then we're just going to do a running seam right here to catch it. And of course there is a 1/2 of an inch of space right here where you could insert a piece of trim. So I have so much of this trim, just every color, every size, every width, just so much I've collected over the years. And you would just pin that in place then and stitch that right into the seam. Pretty cool. 1/8 inch away from the edge, the folded edge here, just make a little running stitch. Again, I pick up about 3 pieces. You should see me right now. I'm in the Airstream. It is 99 degrees in Canyon City, so I do a little bit of taping, and then I turn the air conditioning on, I edit. Once it gets nice and cool in here, I come back, I do a little bit of taping. It's crazy outside. Okay, now I know this is going to be hidden with the next fold, so I'm going to pop a little knot here on the outside, which seems really weird, I know. And then rather than cut it right at the knot, I'm going to bury it inside the seam. Make sure I'm not coming out the other end. And then just clip it right at the fabric. So pretty. So that's, I guess, either the front or the back. You can decide. I like it as the front. I like to see that dual stitching there. And then the back is even pretty. No raw edges or anything. So then the next thing I want to show you, because you'll be able to put on a piece here and a piece here, and that it's the same exact thing, but at some point it's going to be really big. So you're going to want to do a section and then another section and then put the sections together. So what that looks like is, because you're going to want the folded sections all to be on the same side. So put your new section, the one that you're going to attach to your main section or to the other section. So the right side is facing down, the wrong side is facing you. 1/2 of an inch away from the edge. Okay, pin it and then work your seam. Okay, we're 1/2 of an inch away here and 1/8 of an inch away from this edge. Just going to do another little running stitch. Now when you get to where it's a little bit bulkier, because I've already done a seam here, just dig down into the fabric to make sure that you can see the stitching on the other side. And then we'll stitch it right to here. I'm going to go turn on the air and do this. Okay, and so I've knotted it at the beginning of the end. I did my running stitch. I'm going to open this up. And then you can see, because we put that on the wrong side of the fabric, all the seams are similar, they match. But I'm in a bit of a predicament, because when I fold this down and stitch it up right here, I've got this angle. But I think with this, let's learn together to see if we can't, when we're into this scenario if we can't just put another piece here, and that way I don't have to slice this off. I am kind of curious, so together we're going to figure this out. If I wait to stitch this on, maybe I put this on another piece and then fold that over here, and then I'll have some room to work. So let's go ahead and try that. Let's see, color. I think the gold would be really pretty right there. So I'm going to slice off a piece of this gold. And big shocker, I'm using a rotary cutter for this. No ruler though. You're attaching a new piece. You're just going to put the piece that you're working with on the top, right side up. Now this you don't have to worry about because there's no seam on it or anything, and it's double-sided so that anything goes there. And let's just try this. You know, if I'm really smart, I'm going to go here, so when I fold it open, maybe this will just continue along here. Let's be just real smart about this. A little experiment. Okay, so I'm just going to set that aside for a minute. Pin it in place. And then with the 2 strands of DMC floss, I'm just going to start right here and just stitch that all the way down. So now that I have folded this down, what's really cool about the lace too is it's going to lay over that piece, which I think is really kind of neat. Okay, folding it under, pin it, and then I'm going to stitch this seam right from here down and let that trim just lay right on top. With angles it's just tricky because it's kind of like paper piecing, which incidentally we will be doing hand stitch paper piecing next week. But it's with angles, you just never know when you flip it up. It's totally different than you think it's going to be when you stitch it on. So it's just a lot of planning and that kind of thing, which I'm not really, I can do, but I really just like this improv action, you know, just like, let's just stitch on this piece. This will be pretty without a lot of planning. But then you do get yourself into these little situations where you have to do some figuring. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stitch this seam down. Okay, yay, so that's totally going to work. I stitched that down and now I can stitch to the end of this. However, having a little Bob Ross moment here because we've got to first continue this stitch line up here. Now it doesn't matter what's happening here because remember this is all going to get covered. But so I don't get myself into that same little predicament again, before I stitch that and then complete this seam, what I'm going to do is pretend this is not here and I'm going to add a piece of fabric this way. That way I can come all the way up that gold seam here, right? And not get myself into that situation again. But it's just good to figure this out and you know, see what happens in the creative process, because you know, I could have easily just taken this out and you know, done straight seams on camera and let you guys know, oh, it's just easy and no big deal, but it's really not. You know, what you see on camera is definitely just the very end result of a creative process that can actually go awry sometimes. So all good. When you want to add a new piece onto it, all you're going to do is, I think I talked through this, but I want to make sure you know, because you know, you're involved in my creative process here, is that you would put a piece of fabric down on your board and then put the Pajagi right side up, so seam side up, right? And pin that in place. Then you're free to stitch along this line and then fold it over and stitch it. And then before I attach this piece, I'm just going to go ahead and continue right along with that stitch line. I got really close here, didn't I? But again, It's gonna be fine because this is all hidden. The back still looks really cool. You know, just make sure that I'm gonna hide that underneath so that the raw edge won't show in that little patch. Might just go a little bit deeper in the seam. Okay, so I've stitched all the way up to the line. We're gonna fold our little 1/4 of an inch under so the raw edges match each other. And now we can stitch that little piece of Oya in. Now I can just slice that off and then put something on the end and this block will be done. Then you want to watch your edge too, because obviously I don't want to cut this off. I think it's safe right there. So pin it so you can see the little clusters, and you can manipulate it a bit while you're stitching. You just want to make sure it's pinned. Okay, so I'll work on stitching this down. Here is my finished Pajagi block, all pressed and trimmed up. I found this amazing trim that I love the way you can see the seams through the circles, and the colors are perfect. But I don't want to stitch it on until I finish the edges because I cut off half my knots in the trimming, so I don't want to manhandle this thing until I get it finished. And as far as that goes, I think I'm going to do Pajagi strips and just match the rest of the block. And then I'll stitch the trim on, and then I'll stitch it together with my Crazy Log Cabin from last week block into my Southwest journal. But I love it. I love that you can see the seams through the light, and it's what a great technique. So I definitely plan on making more Pajagi. Now I want to show you an Oya pattern real quick that I adopted from this old book that my Aunt Meg gave me when I was 12. Now, I can't say I stitched any of these when I was 12, but I am sure glad to have it now. It's so hard to find books with such elaborate and delicate crochet trims, so this one is a keeper. It's the bottom one shown here that I'm going to show you. I just took that pattern and then rewrote it because it was worded all funky, and then added beads. So the top two patterns, I'm working on a series of my own designs of Oya, and I'll be writing that up, and that PDF will be available along with the crochet mandala and the project bowl. But I love the way the top one twists and looks like a fantastical floral piece, so you'll definitely be seeing that. So here I'm using a size 8 pearl cotton, 2 different size 8 seed beads, and a 1.8 millimeter hook. The one shown, I used a 1.5 millimeter, and it was so tiny. So I want to try it just a little bit bigger. The pattern is a multiple of 6. So what you're going to do is cast on 42 so we can have 7 repeats of this pattern. So you just want to make sure that you have enough beads here. And what you're going to do is just string on these size 8 beads in every other color. So start with the outer color, the one that's going to be the bottom, and then the top where I have the picot is going to be where the blue is. So just, I think you'll just need 6 of the picots if my math is right, but math is really hard. So just string on a couple extra just in case. So now go ahead and chain on 42 stitches. Okay, so I've got my 42 on there. So you're going to do a treble crochet cluster. So yarn over twice, and that's going to be in the 5th chain. So count down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and work your cluster in there. Now be careful when you go into your stitch. We're going to be working 2 clusters in this. So make sure that you've got 2 threads on the top portion. So to work the first cluster, you just work a regular treble crochet, but don't go through the last 2. So leave that on the hook. Yarn over twice, and in that same spot, work another treble crochet up to the last 2 stitches of that one, you'll have 3 on your hook. Then yarn over and go through all 3. And that's your first cluster. Bring up a bead all the way up to your hook and then chain 1 to lock that bead in place. Chain 3, 1, 2, 3, and then we're going to do a picot with a bead in the middle of it. So you're going to chain 2, 1, 2, pull up your picot bead, lock it in place, chain 1, and then slip stitch in the 3rd chain from the hook. So it's the stitch right on the other side of that bead. Make sure you're going in so that there are 2 threads on the top, always, always. Then chain 3, 1, 2, 3, and then you're going to make a treble crochet cluster in the same place. The reason why we only did 2 here is because we have that first chain that counts as your triple. So you have 3 triples that cluster up together at the top. So yarn over twice, and we're working all the way back down here in the same chain as before. Remember to leave that last loop on there. If you're having a hard time with this, just try maybe your initial chain to be loose. Now I've got 3 loops, 1 more. Then when you have 4 loops, you're going to yarn over and go through all 4. Now bring up a cluster bead, which are the lower beads. Bring it all the way up to the hook and chain 1 to lock it in place. Okay, so we're going to work another treble crochet cluster in the 6th chain. So there's a tiny, tiny little chain that gets kind of buried when you work a whole bunch of stitches into one. So what I'll do is I'll yarn over first and then I'll find that chain. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then start the process over again. There's 1. Same chain down here. Two. Three. So I have 4 loops, yarn over, bring through all 4. Okay, and then this is where you're going to chain 3, 1, 2, 3, and then do your bead picot, 1, 2, Pull that bead up really tight next to your crochet, chain 1, then slip stitch in the 3rd chain from the hook, which is the one just on the other side of your bead. Chain 1, 2, 3, and now we have to come back down in that same stitch right there. It's starting to get a little stretched out. You might be able to see that. And then you want to gather all of those up at the top, so you yarn over and go through all 4. Bring up your bead, your cluster bead, real close to the hook, and chain 1 to pop that in there. So this is what it is looking like. This bead's going to just hang down here, and then you've got your clusters in between. So just follow that repeat all the way to the end. So each cluster that you do will have 2 clusters out of it. So when you reach the end of this little pattern repeat here, where you've done cluster, picot, cluster, you're going to start another cluster 6 stitches down the road. Make sure you're going into the bottom chain. I know this is so tiny. You have 4, and then yarn over and go through all 4. And then your picot. So you know you're about to do a picot because you only have 1 cluster, and that picot sits between the clusters. Okay, so just repeat that to the end and see what yours measures. Okay, when you get to the last 6 chains, you breathe a sigh of relief. Pull that bead up, chain 1, and then just work a triple crochet cluster in the last stitch. And that gives you a 4-inch piece of Oya. So as long as you cast on a multiple of 6 stitches, you can just make this as long as you want and use it for anything you want to. And that concludes this insanely long video. I promise the rest of the summer block videos will be much shorter. We're just going to do 1 block a week. These 2 were just long. I had that extra little project, and then of course we needed to do the journal. I know I had some requests on showing how to do that, so I hope you found that useful and enjoyable. I know you're busy, so I will try to keep these much shorter, and I have a ton going on too. I have got a house to rip down, a bear to deter, and all of these blocks to stitch into my ongoing journal. So next week, as I said, we will be doing a 6-inch hand-stitched paper piecing block. So that will be really fun. I'll show you how to draw all that out, and we'll just make it really simple. Here are a few photos that came through on Mandala Unplugged. I have what I think is an awesome idea to take everybody's summer squares and add them to the Mandala Unplugged Facebook page, and then at the end of this summer, when we've got all of our squares, I'm going to turn it into a PDF poster, and I'll post it to my website and then also to the Mandala Unplugged page, so you can print it out and maybe you can even make out a little poster out of it or something. That's what I'm going to do. And we are calling it the Digital Unity Quilt, based on one of my most favorite shows of all time, Parks and Rec. So now I think I'm going to go ahead and veg out to that show, finish up the Pajagi block, and relax. Until next week, happy stitching and be well. Bye-bye.